In the Canadian Arctic, life operates at the physical limit of the planet. Here, extreme temperatures, unstable ice, and scarce food determine who survives to the end of winter. Predators depend on precision, prey on energy conservation. Every movement has a cost, every mistake a consequence. Throughout this episode, we observe how different species face this critical transition between permanent ice and seasonal change. Before we continue, if this type of documentary captivates you, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching it from. At the end of the Arctic winter, the main limitation is energy. Sea ice offers a hunting platform, but it can also fail without warning. In the tundra, wind and snow increase the cost of every kilometer. In this region, survival is about balancing movement, food, and rest. If you enjoy documentaries like this, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. In the Arctic, energy is currency. Predators reduce their movements and depend on the slightest signs in the ice. Prey alternate between short feeding periods and long pauses to avoid heat loss. Even small species use the subsurface snow as insulation against wind and cold. As the light slowly increases, the landscape changes, and so do the roots. And with the ice adjusting with each tide, the risk is redistributed. For Arctic predators, hunting doesn't mean running. It means waiting. The ice transmits vibrations, the wind carries scents, and the silence reveals even the slightest movements. Each attempt requires calculation. Expending too much energy can be as fatal as not eating. In this environment, efficiency trumps strength. With the gradual increase in light, the Arctic enters a transitional phase. The ice still bears weight, but fissures and fragile areas are expanding. Animals must decide when to move and when to stay. Old routes may fail. New paths require constant reconnaissance. In this environment, information, not speed, reduces risk. In the Arctic, different species use the same spaces at different times. Tracks indicate efficient routes, resting areas, and safe passage points. This indirect sharing reduces energy costs and increases predictability. Territory is not fixed. It changes according to wind, ice, and food availability. Recognizing these patterns is an essential part of survival. Surviving extreme cold depends less on movement and more on adaptation. Dense fur, layers of fat, and specific postures reduce heat loss. Many species adjust their activity schedules and use the terrain as shelter from the wind. In the Arctic, thermal efficiency is as important as finding food. If you appreciate documentaries that observe nature with rigor and detail, subscribe to the channel, and feel free to comment on where you're watching from. The Arctic connects people all over the world. At the end of the Arctic winter, the daily pace slows down. Many species reduce activity to the bare minimum, alternating short periods of movement with long pauses. This strategy limits heat loss and preserves fat reserves. In the Arctic, survival doesn't depend on doing more, but on doing only what is essential. As light progressively increases, visual references expand. Shadows, terrain, and wind lines aid in orientation. Some species begin longer migrations, while others simply adjust existing routes. The change is gradual. In the Arctic, anticipating future conditions reduces immediate risks and conserves energy throughout the season. As winter draws to a close, the pressure for food increases. Accumulated reserves begin to dwindle, and mistakes become more costly. Predators carefully assess each attempt. Prey adjusts schedules and routes to reduce exposure. In the Arctic, scarcity doesn't arrive suddenly. It intensifies gradually. As scarcity intensifies, Many species enter prolonged phases of observation. Movements become less frequent, and decisions are postponed until reliable signs appear. Staying alert, without expending energy, becomes a dominant strategy. In the Arctic, waiting can be as important as acting. Not all changes in the Arctic are gradual. Specific events, a wind front, a sudden fracture, a tidal variation, can alter the landscape in minutes. Under these conditions, decisions need to be revised quickly. A safe path may cease to exist. A productive area may become unviable. Here, the cost of error increases when the environment changes faster than the animal's response. After isolated events, behavior changes again. The environment needs to be reassessed. Trails are reviewed, exposed areas avoided, and more stable zones become the focus of activity. Recovery is not immediate. In the Arctic, resuming movement requires confirming, step by step, whether the energy cost has returned to an acceptable level. In the Arctic, great results are born from small, repeated decisions. Course adjustments, longer pauses, and shelter choices indicate trends. Over days, these patterns define who maintains reserves and who approaches the limit. The environment doesn't demand immediate answers. It requires consistency over time. As the season progresses, options dwindle. Efficient trails become established, unstable areas are avoided, and decisions become less flexible. The environment reduces margins for error. For each species, choosing where to go and where not to go becomes as important as finding food. In the Arctic, boundaries are defined before the climax. With increasingly limited options, pressure mounts. Efficient routes concentrate traffic, marginal areas are abandoned, and the energy cost of detours increases. Small losses begin to weigh more heavily. The system enters a sensitive state, in which maintaining efficiency is the only way to postpone the limit imposed by the station. As the season progresses, not all choices remain open. Changing course can cost too much energy. Staying put can reduce future opportunities. Each species begins to operate with clear trade-offs between risk, effort, and reward. In the Arctic, late decisions tend to be definitive, and the room for correction diminishes rapidly. When choices become definitive, the consequences begin to accumulate. Fixed routes concentrate movement, avoided areas cease to offer alternatives, and small detours no longer pay off. The system enters a chained response phase. Each previous decision limits the next. In the Arctic, this sequence defines who maintains operational margin and who approaches the functional limit. At this point in the season, the margin for error is minimal. Established routes reduce effort, but increase dependence. Any change, wind, brittle ice, or delay, can have a direct impact on the energy balance. Survival then depends on maintaining consistent decisions in an environment that is increasingly intolerant of deviations. As the season approaches its critical point, the signs accumulate. Routes converge, opportunities dwindle, and decisions begin to have lasting effects. The environment enters a phase of anticipation. There is still movement, but every choice already considers what lies ahead. In the Arctic, the climax is prepared in silence. At this stage, the transition ceases to be subtle. The ice changes texture, the light alters behavior, and old roots lose reliability. Some species accelerate their decisions, others further reduce their movement. The system enters an observable point of change. It is not yet the climax, but the signs are clear. The balance of winter begins to give way. From this point on, decisions are no longer reversible. The environment imposes clear limits, and the energy cost of any mistake becomes immediate. Every move is calculated based on the present, not on what might come later. At the climax, the consequences can no longer be postponed. Every choice produces immediate effects: energy expenditure, loss of access, or exposure to risk. There is no room for long-term adjustments. The Arctic responds at the same pace as the decisions. At the height of the pressure, the effects accumulate. Alternative routes disappear, previously neutral areas become costly, and operational space narrows. Survival now depends on upholding previous decisions with no room for correction. At the peak of the climax, every action has an immediate cost. There is no excess energy, nor redundant paths. Moving forward, stopping, or retreating produces measurable consequences. Survival now depends solely on how efficiently each species responds to the conditions of the moment. After the peak of pressure, the system begins to respond. Not all decisions lead to immediate collapse. Some strategies resist and create small windows of stability. It is in this interval that survival ceases to be pure reaction and returns to depending on fine adjustments to the environment. Still restrictive, but momentarily predictable. If this type of documentary, based on real-life observation and environmental data, makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. With the immediate pressure reduced, the system enters a reorganization phase. Movements resume, but remain cautious. Species test newly stabilized limits and adjust routines. It is not a full recovery. It is functional adaptation to an environment that remains demanding and subject to rapid changes. With the reorganization underway, the final adjustments are beginning to appear. Routines are being redefined, useful areas are consolidated, and extreme behaviors are giving way to more stable strategies. The environment still imposes limits, but now offers enough predictability for species to prepare for the next phase of the Arctic cycle. As the cycle nears its end, patterns solidify. The environment doesn't become easier, just more predictable. Species that have adjusted their behavior and energy expenditure maintain functional stability. In the Arctic, survival doesn't mean conquering the environment, but operating within the limits it imposes at each stage of the year. With the cycle stabilized, the results become evident. Species that have adjusted their behavior, route, and energy expenditure maintain functionality. Others operate at their limit. In the Arctic, survival is not defined by strength or speed, but by the ability to respond correctly to predictable environmental changes throughout the season. With the system stabilized, the ecological dynamics resume operating at a continuous pace. Predators, prey, and opportunists maintain efficient patterns within the constraints of the environment. The Arctic does not offer comfort, but it does provide sufficient predictability for life to continue functioning. It is this operational balance that sustains the ecosystem until the next seasonal change. With the established patterns, the system enters a phase of continuous observation. There are no extreme events, only the maintenance of the achieved equilibrium. Each species operates within clear limits, responding to predictable stimuli. In the Arctic, this temporary stability is the signal that the cycle has fulfilled its function before the next seasonal transition. At the end of this cycle, the Arctic returns to a functional state of equilibrium. This is not permanent stability, but a temporary configuration that allows life to continue. Predators, prey, and opportunists operate within clear limits, sustaining the ecosystem until the next environmental change redefines the rules again. With the cycle completed, the Arctic continues to function continuously. There is no definitive end, only a transition to a new set of conditions. Species maintain efficient routines while the environment preserves its temporary equilibrium. What we observe now is the silent continuity of a system that never interrupts its rhythm. At the close of this cycle, the Arctic remains in functional equilibrium. There is no dramatic resolution, only continuity. Life continues to operate within clear limits, sustained by adaptations accumulated throughout the season. The system remains active, ready to respond to the next environmental change that will inevitably come. The cycle observed here is not an exception. but part of a continuous pattern. In the Canadian Arctic, life persists through adaptation, not excess. Each season redefines boundaries, and each species responds within them. This is how survival is maintained in one of the most demanding environments on the planet. If you watch documentaries based on real-life observation and environmental science, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where you're watching this episode from. This video is a visual and narrative recreation made with the support of artificial intelligence for educational and entertainment purposes. The scenes are illustrative and may not accurately represent real animal behavior or the environments depicted.